A lot of funders are fed up with the status quo and eager to explore more collaborative and relational ways of working despite shrinking global aid. But do they know exactly what needs to change? Welcome. We're glad you found us. You're listening to Rewilded, a podcast for the social imagination where we bring on individuals and organizations to talk about their moments of creativity, discovery, and boldness in a world needing new and diverse imaginations. On this episode, Ignited Word's Malaika Cheney-Coker is joined by network weaver Vaida Odongo as they dive into the underlying infrastructure of global grant making, why restricted funding keeps social innovators stuck in silos, why most funders gladly pay for shiny new communication tools while completely ignoring the invisible human glue that holds networks together, and what happens when we replace lengthy application forms and reports with radical real world trust.
Ida, welcome. We're so happy to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm super happy to be here as well.
Wonderful. So, you and I have connected on and off. And as you know, one of the reasons why you and I connected was over our map of possibility philanthropy, which has taken us, an imagination focused firm, into the space of thinking about philanthropy present and philanthropy future, which is what really got my attention when I looked at some of your writing. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about some of the things that are happening in the space of philanthropic networks that maybe aren't on people's radar as much, but that are a big part of your work and your passion.
The one thing that I know is that at the very base of any network, we're all dealing with people. And so people are relationships. And when you look at it that way, networks become less complex and they become this beautiful living thing that actually has and serves a purpose. Yeah. And so what I'm seeing right now in philanthropy is that there are a lot of funders who are frustrated by the order of things, like from what I have experienced and seen is that philanthropy and the funding that comes, especially here to the continent here in Africa, is that the funding is very restricted. It has a lot of, I'd say, top-down management. It's also very short-term, which usually puts the social innovators in a very, I would say, fight and flight situation where they're always thinking about the next funding round. And even if you do belong to a network, you're not able to actually participate in it fully, engage with other members because they're just thinking about how do I keep the lights on in my organization. Even thinking about these challenges because they're also existing where in a poly crisis, I would say, where we have multiple challenges happening at the same time. It's like you can't even catch a breath. How can we catch a breath? And I think in all of these things happening, that funders and philanthropists who are actually thinking about doing things differently. Yeah. And so behind the scenes, even with shrinking global aid, with a lot happening over the last 1 year, I can say that a lot of funders are thinking more about how do we collaborate? How do we come together so that we can fund a larger group of grantees? We can have more impact and we can just not duplicate efforts as much. And I think that's the new order of funding and philanthropy, where it's more about coming together, collaborating, and supporting grantees as much as best as any funder can.
Wow, that's fascinating. And I love the sort of fork in the road, if you could call it that, or maybe not so much a fork, but a bit of a pivot and an emergence of a new reality that you're describing. Like on the one hand, this status quo is well known. It's a very familiar pain point of restricted short-term funding, but this awakening that you're describing amongst funders, and we have seen some of this too in our work and our research, like action towards supporting collaboration and this network infrastructure and realizing the status quo will not do. That's one of the inspiring aspects and one of the things that we're trying to capture in our map of possibility. So could you maybe then, if there is this intention and this awareness, could you give us maybe a sense of, is there something standing in the way of maybe more funders coming on board with this, or even help us understand contextually, is this just like a very small and progressively minded, I mean, progressive in the sense of understanding what needs to be done differently, group of funders? Is it coming to where it's more of a wave? Maybe help us right size it and also help us understand some of the obstacles standing in the way of making this more widespread.
Oh, wow. I mean, Malaika, I feel like one of the most fundamental things in any collaboration or partnership or just a group is trusting each other. And that's a big barrier when it comes to philanthropists. I mean, from what I'm observing, I'm seeing a lot of duplication of efforts, which means that philanthropists want a lot of funders want to do their own thing, where you're in your own siloed space, you're doing your own thing, you're just known for a particular thing and supporting a particular sector. Because then if you collaborate with other funders or philanthropists, are you going to share this glory? Are you going to both be, is your funding, I would say, going to be directly attributed to that grantee's success, or do you share that that limelight? So I think one of the things that really philanthropists need to think about is how do we collaborate in spaces where we trust each other? Because when we trust each other, then that trust also cascades down to our days.
That is fascinating, because a little earlier you were talking about, in revisiting one of the articles that you wrote about network infrastructure, one of the points was really about trust in grantee networks and how that's essential for true relationship building. And I hadn't been thinking about this relational layer with the funders themselves and in the funding ecosystem, that if there isn't that trust, it makes it very difficult to collaborate in such a way where there is this kind of give and take and pulled effort that you're talking about. So I feel like you've covered a lot of this already in your remarks, but I'm curious if there's like one thing, we're always looking for like the thing that's the most overlooked, or the one thing that you think most funders and philanthropic organizations get wrong about building the kind of philanthropic networks that you're talking about.
I'll just give an example here. So I talk about trust a lot because it really forms the basis of all our relationships. And so I'll talk about what it will take for funders to actually create the right environment for these social innovators to thrive, and for them to also collaborate with other people. So picture this scenario, Malaika, you are building a friendship with someone, you met them, and every 6 months, this friend has to ask you to justify why it's worth investing in this friendship, So you have to send a report to the metrics. So, hey, we went on 10 dates and we went on 5 walks and we had 3 dinners. And so because of this, our friendship has higher value or has more weight compared to if you are going out on 1 date every 6 months. And so if you just compare this to the funder grantee relationship, it actually shows you how much distrust there is in these relationships, which also affects how grantees interact with each other. And so one of the things that funders need to get right is for you to actually be a good funder and for your money to make sense. Well, number one, you need to trust your grantees that they know what they're doing and they actually have the resources within them to actually solve their issues. One thing that I'm also seeing, I also see funders do a lot, is they fund siloed projects, and then at one point assume that if you put all these people in a room, something magical will happen, and they'll all come together, form a network, collaborate, solve systemic issues, and then it's such a beautiful world and such a beautiful process, but it rarely happens that way. What funders need to know is that networks take time. They take time to form and to strengthen and to sustain. They also need resourcing. And so by time, I mean, you need multiple engagements for the members, for them to actually form the relationships that will help them to collaborate and solve issues. And so without that time, then it becomes very hard to solve anything because it should just be people meeting and then going home. We talk about invisible infrastructure a lot when it comes to building very strong networks. And so what I've seen a lot of philanthropists do is fund the visible layers of a network. So when you look at a network, as I alluded before to it being a living organism, there are things you will see very, very quickly when you look at it. So we'll see things like physically, you can see like communication tools, you can see shared calendars, shared resources. But the things you actually can see are the strands that connect people with each other. So how are people trusting each other? Do they have shared norms and cultures within this network? And then Are they also giving back? Is there a culture of reciprocity within this network that allows the network to form and to actually sustain itself? And so these are some of the things I see a lot of networks get wrong. And so this also means that most of the time it's only one part of the equation that gets funding. So the visible part gets funded, and then the invisible part is left to chance. But done well and resourced, it means that the network actually has a longer way to go compared to it being something that is just left to chance.
Got it. So trust, all these cultural and relational elements are super necessary and vital to building strong networks.
Mm-hmm.
And as you're talking about trust, I'm really thinking about the trust-based philanthropy initiative, or I hesitate to call it movement, but perhaps it has aspects of a movement. It's certainly increasingly talked about, ascribed to by more and more donors, and understood. I don't know how effective it's been, but I do see that it's had some effect and permeated the sector to a degree. Help us understand what extending that sort of sphere of trust looks like. And you did already to a degree, and this opened up a fascinating proposition for me. Like, we're thinking about the need for trust between funder and grantee, and there's still a ton of work to be done there, obviously. How does the sort of peer-to-peer trust look like if it's extended to other funders?
I could talk to an experience I've had working with a group of funders who are trying to think about this new way of supporting networks and collectives. From what I've seen, just building a basic community of practice of funders just requires having the right people in the room. So by this, I mean, they're all people who have like a shared vision or goal. You know, they all want the same thing. They want to fund in a certain way. They will have some values that they all share. And this is what brings the group together. And so once this group has come together, then there's a reason why they want to engage. So I think like for a particular funder, if you're a philanthropist who wants to change how you interact with your grantees and other funders in your ecosystem, then it is easier to learn that from a peer compared to just trying out whatever you can. Because I feel like, you know, you don't always need to make mistakes for you to learn from them. You can learn from other people's mistakes, which is much easier, in my opinion. If you can in any way learn from your peer, that actually helps you to achieve your goals faster. The community of practice that I've seen work very well is because in the design process, there are multiple goals that need to be hit in order for this community to make sense for everyone. So for the design team and also for the funders as well. So one of the things is, how do we create the right environment for people to form relationships? Because it is from knowing each other, witnessing each other's work and learning more about what they do that you're able to realize, oh, hey, I had funder X and Y say that they are in this sector, in this country. That's something we're open to exploring. I'd want to reach out to them and start a conversation. And so that actually leads to something bigger down the road. And I think in any network or funder community you're in, I don't see why you should know everyone there. I think it just makes sense for you to identify the people who would be the most you would want to engage with regularly and then build very deep, meaningful relationships with them. And then I will talk about the learning as well. When I join a network as a funder, one thing that I'm looking to do is to learn more from other people. So what are they doing? What are their practices? What mistakes have they made? What failures have they had? How can I learn from them so that I'm not going to replicate some of these issues and some of these negative practices in my own work so that I'm actually a better funder? So when you talk about the trust-based philanthropy movement, it's more about people who want to fund differently. They want to fund in a way that is humane, in a way that actually centers trust and the people who are on the other end of the funding, which hasn't been the case historically. The third layer I talk about when it comes to these philanthropic networks is thinking about externally influencing other peers. Based on the relationships I have built with the funders in this network, what I have learned from them, how can I also influence other people within my circles externally so that then it starts to become a movement. It goes from being a group of, let's say, 5 funders to 20 to 50 to 100 till it becomes a movement and everyone is talking about this new way of funding. And I think that's really where all the possibilities lie in terms of these big, bold visions. Like, how can we achieve them together where we are in strong and deep relationships and we know where we are going, we have the shared goals, we have shared values, and we want to actually become better people and funders.
Wow, that's wonderful. And I'm glad you mentioned the big, bold vision, because you also mentioned funding people in a more humane way. And obviously, there is that, which is really important, even at the core of why the status quo needs to change. But there's also the practical elements, which you were covering at the start of the conversation about the things like the poly crisis and why what you were just talking about now, like the possibility of being able to tackle big, bold visions together. But can you help us and our listeners understand a bit more about that? Like, if a funder is to go through, and it's not just that we're thinking only about targeting the to-do list to funders. There is work, I imagine, the grantee end, because we've had experiences too where recipient organizations aren't necessarily conditioned to or used to working in a more trust-based, open kind of collaborative relationship with funders. And there are other aspects where the status quo is so entrenched that it's also, there is a learning curve for grantees. I don't know if you have, but help us understand the why of all this. Why go through the trouble? Why undertake the unlearning and the behavior change needed to shift to this new way of doing things?
This is such an important question, Malaika. The problem the world has faced and continues to face can only be solved when people actually collaborate with each other. So, I think of systems. Systems they are made and held and upheld by people because it works for some people in that system, and that's why they work the way they do. And so if we talk about, like, let's say, for example, a broken market system. So we're just thinking about the agricultural supply chain where a farmer is unable to access fair markets, they're unable to sell their goods at a fair price in any market. There is a problem there. But then even in that problem where this farmer is not getting what they deserve, there's someone along that chain that is actually benefiting from that broken system. If you look at the why, when we need to invest in relationships, we need to invest in networks, it's because when we have multiple people working towards the same problem, it becomes more doable. Like, solving the problem becomes a reality. Yeah. Because in that solving the problem of, let's say, like a broken agricultural supply chain, there are multiple actors within that system. So we have let's say there's a farmer, there are people in policy, there are organizations, there are communities, there are so many stakeholders here that if we don't work with them all in relationship with each other, then we'll continue having the same problem. And so what I see a lot of philanthropists do is just fund one part of that broken ecosystem. Yeah, it just solves a small part of the puzzle, but then the problem continues to exist. And so why we need to invest in these relationships is realizing that when you notice that we are 5 people or 5 funders who all want to solve the same problem, but in very siloed ways, it will be much better to come together and identify how can we solve this problem as a collaborative, as a group of people who are very passionate about solving it in a way that does not duplicate our efforts, but also makes our money go a bit further. And so thinking about if your specialty is in advocacy as a funder, then another funder is really great as just investing in a social enterprise that could make a product that will compete internationally. I think those are really great people that can work together. So the work is hard because investing in relationships takes time. Actually, the biggest bottleneck towards actualizing a lot of these networks and groups of people is just because it takes a lot of coordination, and that coordination is really not funded again because it's left to chance. So, Malaika, I don't know, I know you've been part of maybe, let's say, conferences and events whereby you go, you feel so inspired, you're like, wow, I'm going to change the world. I met 10 people, we are all aligned that we're going to all we're going to work together to try and solve the issues. But then you go home, and then 3 to 6 months later, you keep in touch maybe with a few of them, and then within a year, you haven't really done anything. It's because for you to actually move the relationship from just knowing each other at a basic level to deepening it, somebody needs to coordinate that. And if you do not have someone who has the bandwidth and the resources to do so, the work is left out, is left to chance. And so for a lot of networks where all the good intentions stall is who is doing this coordination, who is bringing people together, who is holding this vision for the network, who is holding the room, the container, who is accountable for us meeting, for us being in a group, for us trying to move towards our goals.
Yeah, that's definitely an experience that so many of us can relate to, like feeling the power of networking and being in meeting people, seeing the potential of that collaboration, and then not having the space and support to keep it up. But back to sort of the term philanthropic networks, that implies that they exist. I'd love to hear, in what form do they currently exist, and which are the ones that are doing things differently? Or are there any call outs that you want to make, whether a name or not, to the good practice happening in this area?
I think there are very many, like, again, it goes back to what the original goals of that philanthropic network was when it was being formed. And so there are some pretty awesome ones, which I am also a part of. So one of them that I would actually mention is the Nairobi Women Funders Group. And this is a group of women funders who are based here in Nairobi, Kenya, and they basically meet quarterly to plan together, share resources, and just continue building deep relationships that can help us basically to become better funders, know what other people are doing. I think when I look at what the Funders Network does well is bringing together such a diverse group of women who have experiences in different areas. And these are all philanthropists who are doing really amazing work here on the continent and have really impacted a lot of grantees. That is the one that I have really engaged with, that has made a lot of space for my own growth, and I've seen a lot of people grow through it. In terms of broadly, the other philanthropic networks that exist are usually a bit larger. So from what I see, and I want to mention them, it's usually much easier to get lost in these networks because they are very big. And then the structure is also quite loose. So if anytime I'm not intentional with engaging with them, so because of resources, because of bandwidth, then I sort of lose myself in the network. And so I think a great network is one whereby you can hold your members close and they have something that keeps bringing them back to the group because they want to form relationships with other people, they want to learn, and they just want to become better at funding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so fascinating because I am aware of some too, and they're mostly in the gender space, interesting enough, or they're women's rights funders networks. And it's true. Like, I think in some ways, we're conditioned to think about a good philanthropic network being a big one, perhaps, right?
Yeah.
Awesome reach. And you're bringing up some of the downsides of that. I'm sure there's ways in which you can be big and yet do the things you're talking about, which is, bring members together, have tighter structures within that. But I'll leave it to you and others to define what that looks like. Is there one thing that most funders and philanthropic organizations get wrong about building philanthropic networks? I know in a way we were just talking about, in a way, a pitfall can be size without intentionality about keeping people close knit within it. But is there something else you want to call out that is just something people tend to miss that can go wrong?
Any network needs a network weaver, and by a network weaver, I would say Someone who understands and can hold the container for the group. So it could be one of the philanthropists, or it could be someone external who understands and gets the work very well. So I just feel like without the right resourcing, it is very easy to let for things to go astray or not just go the way they had intended to. So if you think about what actually constitutes a good network is where a member feels like they belong. They also feel like this is where I can be seen. And so when you think about all of those, you have to think about now what else is needed to actually build the sort of environments like this. So before you even start, I think let me just start from the beginning, what I see. So I'll go back to my conference example. We've gone to an event or a conference, we've met, and then we're like, wow, all 10 of us, this 10 group of philanthropists are very passionate about funding education in Africa. And so we're like, yeah, let's go and fund education in Africa. And then a few months later, nothing has happened. No one has picked up anything. And then we meet again. You're like, yeah, we had that. That's a nice idea. We really wanted to try, but yeah, maybe one day. I feel like if you do not have the right structures and systems in place to actually start, strengthen, and grow this network, it will not go anywhere, you know? And so an alternative to, yes, there's this big audacious goal of funding all these nice organizations here on the continent by these funders who have just met. So how do we create the right environment for them to actually collaborate, for them to actually learn from each other and just create the relationships that are required for that? So you ensure that you have the visible and the invisible infrastructure. And I talk about this in my LinkedIn article, because I feel like if you get those right, then you will have a very strong network. Whether you are continuously heavily funding it over multiple years, you will still have it strong because people will still feel a shared sense of identity and belonging. So think about things like having like a name, like having a name where people can say, hey, I'm part of this network, which I love. And, people start attributing a feeling towards belonging in that network. And so that's something very physical and that can be seen. To get to the layer of invisible infrastructure, people need multiple repeated interactions for them to actually form relationships. That's why if you meet someone every year at a conference, it might take 2-3 years plus for you to actually form a relationship compared to meeting someone quarterly. And so if you meet someone multiple times, you're more likely to form a stronger relationship with them. So any network that wants to grow and sustain its efforts has to ensure that there are multiple repeated interactions within it. So even as philanthropists, how frequently are we coming together? Who are we? When are we meeting? Who are we meeting? What are we doing during those meetings? And then what happens after those meetings? Because we usually forget to talk about what happens after any meeting, because that is the most important part. That's actually where people build the relationships. That's where people build the rapport to start talking about systems change. And so we've talked about the visible stuff. Now go to the invisible things. Like I've talked about trust so much, so I will not add any more there. But yes, how do you get people to trust each other? Because if I don't trust you, it's going to be very hard for me to even think about collaborating and trying to solve an issue with you. But then if I trust that other members in this network share the same goals, share the same values and ideals, I'm more likely to engage and ask for help. Yeah. And so I'm more likely to say, hey, I need to work on this particular area, be vulnerable enough and say, I have no idea how to get there. There's this vision. I need to get there. There's a gap between where I am and where I want to go. And so I need help. And it is also important that the network has created the right condition for other members to say, hey, I know you're struggling with identifying like a priority area to fund in, and I can help you do that. I can help you do that as part of the network because we've done that. This is where we have succeeded. This is where we have failed, and we are willing to share that with you. And so I think when you get that, then you get it right in your network, because then people feel a sense of belonging, a sense of shared ownership, and your network has a higher chance of actually sustaining through time. So even if the network weaver is not really ingrained in the day-to-day operations and running of that network, it's basically the members themselves running it, where they feel like, if I need something, this is a network to go to. If I'm feeling lost, if I'm feeling like I need a certain resource, I can go to this network and get that.
Thank you for making that distinction again and explaining sort of the visible versus invisible attributes of a network and how they work. And that's one of the reasons why we do and actually like doing social network analysis at Ignited Word, because it does make some of the both the visible elements and the invisible elements you're talking about visible to a degree, to the extent that people are willing to share their experience of trust or lack thereof in a network. These things can be visualized in a way that I think incentivizes more action around, okay, where's this network lacking as far as who's not well integrated, or where's information, where are bottlenecks happening with information flow. I love the idea of your offers and needs, which is something we've talked about as well. Could also be quite well visualized in mapping to kind of make these things happen, along with the sort of intentional network weaving, or as part of the intentional network weaving that you're talking about. Which brings me maybe to one final question before we go into any other thoughts you want to share and our imagination prompt, which is, how does it happen in a very nuts and bolts way to get this sort of weaving work supports the container you talked about, the person who's literally going to check in with members and coordinate meetings or spaces where people continue to get together and have that ongoing thread of conversation. I've done that before. You've done that before. We know it takes a certain skill set. It's a lot of work. It's energy intensive. It has to be funded somehow. So one thing that came to mind as we were talking is, because I've spent a lot of my career in the MEL space, monitoring, evaluation, and learning, and there was somewhat of a norm where funders were used to allocating a certain budget line for MEL because they understood that it needed to be part of any responsible program. I don't see that awareness around having a budget line for this network infrastructure you're talking about, especially when they're expecting some sort of systems change work to happen somehow. And that's just one idea that came to mind, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on the nuts and bolts of getting this kind of network weaving paid for. What's promising? What do you recommend? Yeah.
Malaika, I think one of the things is, all these invisible things we talk about that are required for systemic change to happen. It's just making them visible, like if we talk about collaboration, are we leaving collaboration to chance where we assume because this group of people are in the same room, they will end up knowing each other, building those relationships and actually collaborating and solving some of these issues? I think a lot of philanthropists assume that innovators or other funders have the bandwidth to actually coordinate and manage a network, which is a lot of work. So even if you're in a group of people, you're a group of funders who are very passionate about what you do, someone has to take up the coordination, they have to take up the actually holding of the vision and the container for the group. And so if one of you does not do that, and that will typically happen because of bandwidth, all these philanthropists are very busy. They are always looking for new grantees, new ways of advocating in new spaces. So they have very limited bandwidth, which is understandable because of the nature of the work. However, it is also identifying that and knowing that for the systemic change to happen, this systems change that you talk about, it requires the people. It requires people to work together, multiple people working towards the same issues or multiple related issues so that they can actually achieve this change. So what I would recommend, even if it's like from a very basic level, if you're a philanthropist and you have a budget line for convenings, who is bringing together the people? Why are they coming together? Even if it's for your small community of practice. So let's talk about this network of funders who are passionate about food security and agriculture. If you're talking about convening and coming together as a group, who is coordinating that? Why are they coordinating it? What needs to be done? What goals do you need to have so that you're not also meeting for meeting? I think one thing that I have noticed in my experience is that a lot of convenings just happen for the sake, like there's something we want to talk about. Let's have a convening. Let's bring people together. We spend a few days in person, we go home, and then we meet at another event a few months or years later. And I think if we are very intentional about the design, it becomes much easier for us to actually collaborate and solve systemic issues. Think about simple things like even now when you go to the part of the grantees as a philanthropic network, what lessons are you learning from the group that can actually go help you become a better funder? I have seen instances where one funder took up the practice of funding collaborations for their grantees because they realized their grantees do not have the bandwidth to actually fund the collaboration. So by this, I mean that even if two grantees are very passionate about, let's say, food security, but they do not have the budgets to actually come together. So this is paying for the most basic things like a plane ticket, hotel, and even logistics around coming together. They will not meet. And so that collaboration that you hope to happen will not happen. And also, if they do not have the money for the project, for whatever project they want to work on together, they will not actualize it because their budget lines are also very restricted. So this goes back to funding practices again. So long as budgets are restricted, grantees will really struggle to collaborate and actually solve systemic issues. Yeah. And so thinking about how can we become more trust-based? How can a funder become more flexible? And how can they offer multiple year grants or multi-year grants that allow their grantees to do so much more in their organizations and with each other so that they can actually achieve systemic change. So that's just one very basic level, just funding the coordination. Going deeper into now the funding practices and thinking about how do we change our practices as a funder. It requires a lot of humility because you have to think about now and acknowledge your role in this whole problem. And so how have you structured your grants? The most basic things. What does your call for application look like? Do you treat your grantees as people or are they just like another organization that ticks the box? What are your mail requirements? Do you need me to check in every 6 months and justify why I need you to give me funding, or is 1 year enough? Do I need to do a 30-page report instead of just do a 1-page report, just updating you on what has been happening? Even in terms of the application process, how burdensome is it for organizations to access your funding? Do I need to fill in a 30-page application and I'll never hear from you? Or can I use different applications that I did in the past? I think it's just thinking about also changing your practices as a funder so that now you can become better at supporting systems change organization. So once we start doing that, then the network coordination roles become a bit easier to see because you realize without this network weaver, there's really no momentum in this network, like there's no momentum, there's nothing happening. Like we are part of this network, but it's quiet. And then we have small bursts of energy. But for a network to become very strong, whereby we don't want it to be in its early days, there has to be consistent touch points with members. So this is in terms of communications, in terms of convenings, in terms of the tools and things that go out to them like newsletters or things like how information flows within the network itself. How does that happen? How can people access information? Is there an online repository where if I need to get something about a particular funder, I can just go there and learn? If I need to get more information about a workshop or a learning lab, there's just somewhere I can go and get all that information. And so that makes the work makes it very visible. And so if you want to achieve systemic change as a funder, I would highly recommend that you fund network coordination roles because the problems that the world is facing right now are just too big and complex for any one organization to tackle alone. So even as a funder, no matter how large your budgets are, there's only so much you can tackle on your own. And this is why we are seeing a lot more funders and philanthropists are going towards working in collaboratives because they also want to reduce duplication of effort. What I see is 5 funders in the same, let's say, sector like health, all funding one organization. Yeah. But then there are like hundreds more that could have benefited from that funding, but then it's also hard to get them and to know them. And so this is a whole conversation in terms of the physical barriers that organizations face when it comes to accessing funding, which we won't go into today. But it's just thinking about how to change our practices as a funder because then this cascades along the entire ecosystem.
So I'm hearing that funding collaboration, funding networking aspect is a very strategic funding target for a funder. I'm also hearing that the trust-based aspect of giving, where there is more flexibility so that the grantee themselves can directly apply those funds towards collaboration should they want to. They have the flexibility within their budget lines. And I'm hearing that the kind of, again, back to sort of like the cultural and attitudinal aspects of this, like the behavior change aspects, where it's about having a stronger open funder grantee relationship, helps funders to understand the shortcomings of a given funding model and to allow the space or be a partner with the grantee to, in this case, it would be to like collaborate with X or XYZ in a way that would not have been as obvious in a sort of more traditional funding relationship. Is that?
Yeah. Spot on, Malaika, spot on. Because traditional philanthropy is very restricted, it's not trust-based at all, and it's very inflexible and very short-term. And so all of those actually perpetuate the network issues we usually see, where there's a lot of mistrust, a lot of us versus them situation, where members just don't want to collaborate with each other because sharing my ideas means that someone else might steal them, And even as funders, do we want to also share our portfolio, or is it just like ours, where we don't want to share good practices, we don't want to share our own systems, how we fund, how we are supporting our grantees with each other, because then it might mean that another funder outshines us compared to where we are at. And so I think it's just thinking about all of those. So I would say network coordination roles are very important. It's important to have someone that actually holds the container for the network, because without that, then things just start frailing at the edges. So the network will just I'll think of it like a woolen sweater, where if one thread just starts, if one thread is loose, it can actually loosen the whole sweater and then you lose everything, And so thinking about it that way then makes sense, because someone who holds the container is able to see, with all the differences in this network, with all the skills, all the resources, all the backgrounds and the lived experiences that members bring, we are stronger together. So I would say, even in this philanthropic network, each member has a very different experience and skill set, as a funder. And so bringing it all together, we would all say, it could be like a kilt, the way you think about a kilt, where everybody, a collage, everybody comes in with their differences, but then they all come together and form something very beautiful, which is that network that I'm talking about.
I think this is a time when we do want to mix metaphors because they're all so apropos in this case. I love the quilt, the sweater, and that also goes with the sort of concept of weaving a network as a tight weave, and the container. Love it all. Which brings me to our imagination prompt, which is, in the year 2040, if there's a nonprofit in Kenya striving to improve lives, what would the experience of that nonprofit be in seeking funding thanks to the philanthropic network of the future, which I assume is all the things that we've talked about today as being the right direction to move in? And of course, one more thing to say is that we will then feature your response in our Map of Possibility Philanthropy.
Oh, awesome. Awesome. I can't wait to see that. I'm very passionate about women and young girls. So I've always worked with women and young girls just across my roles. I think it's just something that, I've held ever since I was very young. I think what I would say, so this is 2040. Wow. I'm just thinking about this young girl who's running an education program in Kisumu. Kisumu is a small town to the west of Kenya, near Lake Victoria. You've been there?
Yes, many times. A story for a different day.
And so I'm just thinking about their experience writing a grant proposal. I would think that it will take less than an hour because, number one, it would be the philanthropists who had reached out to them. So being very proactive in their giving, where they don't have to be chased by anyone. They're really listening in for signals in the in the sector they're in about organizations that are doing great work, they're also in community and networks with other funders. So they know they can hear and say, hey, I've heard about organization X in Kisumu. They're doing amazing work. You need to check them out. So by the time this young woman is applying for funding, people already know her because she's also aware of the networks, that the funder networks available that she can reach out to, that she can access and get funding. And so I think when I think about that, it will be such a beautiful world because she would not waste her time sending multiple proposals. She would actually have the bandwidth to engage in networks that actually can help her collaborate and learn from other innovators. I'd also think that in terms of this funder, they would be more trusting of the grantee. And so they know that she has been doing an amazing job. Other people have vouched for her and they trust her. And so they will not dictate how she needs to spend the money. So this means that the funding that this organization receives will be unrestricted. It will be very flexible because she understands her work. She knows where she needs to invest in. It would also be very long term and not short in terms of, I've seen grant cycles that are like literally 6 months, which are just like, it's very, very confusing to imagine how someone can achieve their goals in 6 months, especially in such in such a big and complicated era. And so this innovator will know, and we aligned with funders who are very passionate about her work, who know her, who are proactive, who trust them, and who see themselves as partners, not as saviors in the funder and grantee relationship. And so it will be more of they're having conversations and she's not filling in a 30-page form. Due diligence is also going to be much easier. It's not going to take a long time. Like typical due diligence in any organization will take 6 months to a year, which is such a long time for any organization to grow. I remember, Malaika, and this is funny, I just remember this now. A few years ago, I was talking to a social innovator, and we were talking about, like the kind of funding they had received, what they needed. And, honestly, this innovator just told me like, hey, I need your funding, but your due diligence is 8 months. By the time you come back in 8 months, I'll be shut down. Like I won't even have money for operations. And so I would love to indulge and be and have these conversations. But honestly, I just don't have the bandwidth because if your due diligence is going to take 8 months to a year for the amount of funding we are giving them, then they would rather not pursue that process. And I think it was very humbling because I think at that point I realized that these grantees also are starting to have like an awakening where they realize that, you know what, there are better funders out there whose due diligence is less than 3 months, or even if it's a long time, we do know where we are going to end up. So it becomes easier for us. And so that was an eye-opener. So back to this organization in 2040, thinking about the grant as a commitment, the grant agreement as a commitment, it's money that I'm receiving to do this work in Kisumu, and I'm committed to it. I've done this work for the last couple of years, or even if it's a much shorter time, I'm committed to it. I'm passionate about it. And then I know who to call in this philanthropic network. Who can I be introduced to? Who can I access and I can naturally take my work to the next level? And I think if being in a philanthropic network like that makes this world possible for grantees, then it will be so amazing because then it will dignify the funder and grantee relationship. It will also be a very great learning curve for other philanthropists because they will learn that, hey, it is possible to actually be more trusting and to be flexible and to just trust that their wordies know what they're doing.
That's such a beautiful vision. I actually hope it happens by 2030, like across the board. 2040 now sounds really far out for us to have to wait for that really tantalizing vision to come to pass. But I love so many things about it. I love that she's an innovator and she's characterized as such, and she needs the flexibility that innovators really need. Innovators can't necessarily predict the problem. Follow step A, B, C. It makes me also think that so many aspects of what we perceive as normal in today's grant-making world reflects that lack of relationship, right? That lack of being known to each other, and to some degree, the lack of trust that comes with that. I understand that there needs to be some type of due diligence to these processes and fairness, but you've outlined what that could look like within a more relational and trust-based ecosystem. So yeah, I love it. You've given us such such a rich vision that we're going to be very, very happy to get up there. Our map is something to aspire to. And for Kisum, I actually was working, this is in another life, I was working on a school water sanitation, hygiene project with a previous employer. And yeah, I was out there maybe twice a year, sometimes three. So they were fun times.
Oh, wow. Mm-hmm. Yeah, a really amazing place, and has a soft spot in my heart because I am actually from the place. So that's actually why I'm just like Kisumu.
Yes, yeah, I remember being, on the shores of Lake Victoria.
Yeah.
This makes it is a very special place. So I didn't know that. Look at that. We'll have to have a whole nother conversation about that.
I know, Malaika. Wow, this is amazing.
Yeah, well, this has been such a rich conversation. Is there anything else you'd like to add that you want to make sure we know and capture before we close out this conversation?
For me, it'll just be a challenge to philanthropists out there to value the relational work of systems change, because I believe that fundamentally systems change can only happen based on the relationships that people have with each other. And so, because all the systemic problems are held in place by people, then it needs the same people to actually solve them. And so, breaking down the barriers towards communication, sharing information, and even coming out to the much higher level of funding. Like, how can we fund the people in a way that we actually stop the bad practices that we've been perpetuating for decades, so that we can actually solve the systemic issues and not keep funding the same thing over and over again without coming to a solution? Because I feel like if you are able to if philanthropists were able to support multiple actors who are all targeting the same goals in the same sector or even interrelated sector, it will be much easier to solve systemic issues. Like, it will be more attainable because it will not be all these fragmented efforts all working towards the same issue. And so the challenge is, how do we fund relationships? How do we fund collectives? How do we fund networks of grantees and organizations so that they can actually achieve change much faster?
I think that's a perfect note to end on, because in my mind, you've given two reasons for two very different types of thinkers. One is the bold visionaries that want to see systems change across the board and have an appetite to tackle the breadth of the problems. And also the people, and they're not always like two separate groups, they can be overlaps, the people that are more pragmatic and understand that this approach creates efficiencies. It, as you said, it doesn't duplicate efforts, it uses funds more effectively, money goes farther. And I think that's a wonderful kind of like enjoinder for the people, funders, but everybody involved in this ecosystem going forward as to why we should go down this path. So thank you so much, Vaida, for laying all this out and walking us through it. And yeah, I'll be so excited to follow your work and see you do more of this and take your message further.
Thank you, Malaika. This has been really amazing. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation.